Hey, how's it going? This is Scribbles. Spent the last few days compiling some match data from the NPA, just to kind of get a better sense of, or give myself a direction, I suppose, for Ultra Series team building. What I've got here is the restricted Pokemon used in every matchup through Week 8, the Megas used, Tapu's used, and if any form of speed control is used. So I compiled that for all the matches up through Week 8. Ended up giving me about 120 matches. And with this data, I went ahead and analyzed win rates, usage rates for all these groups. Didn't quite get to individual restricted. It's a little bit more complicated and you have to remove mirrors for that. And then I also took a quick look at some of the restricted matchups. We're a little short on data for this, so it's not necessarily as good of a conclusion that you can draw from this. But here's some of the interesting things that I found going through it. Before getting into that, I'm going to go through a few quick disclaimers. The NPA, if you're not familiar with it, is just a strong league formed for the sake of playing some VGC matches in a competitive format that's not necessarily at an event. That the current season split between Moon and Ultra Series, so this data is focused solely on the Ultra Series. The data that I've compiled was from matches completed on Showdown with replays uploaded to the VGC threads. In this case, it's 120 total best of 3 matches. The team mega data is based off of reasonable assumptions. So essentially, if I see a mega and it isn't confirmed to not be mega, there's a couple cases where, like a Gengar, for instance, had a focus sash. I'm going to go ahead and assume it's a mega. Team speed control data is a little bit looser. So I based this off what was used in matches, not what a team may or may not have had. Obviously, if you see a Crobat or like a Braviary, you have a good sense that it's going to be Tailwind. But basically, the speed control data here is more useful in terms of how effective was using that move in a game to securing victory. The next section here, the data is presented on a game-by-game basis. So I went through each individual game, not necessarily match data. So that gives you a better sense. If you win 2-0, feel like you had a really strong matchup. If you win 2-1, maybe you had an advantage, but it wasn't as strong. I think game-by-game data is a little bit better than match data. So without further ado, we're just going to kind of jump in and go through some of this stuff here. First thing is the restricted combinations. So through the first 8 weeks of the NPA, you can see basically where all of the restricted combinations end up stacking up for usage. Obviously, Groudon Xerneas is dominating. It's almost a quarter of teams are using Groudon Xerneas as a combination. Going down from there, you see Kyogre Ray, Groudon Lunala, Lunala Xerneas, Rayquaza Xerneas, all floating around that 10% usage. Not any real surprises there. Those are all really strong archetypes that you kind of expected to see. I guess the one that you may not have seen immediately going into the season would be something like Groudon Lunala maybe would be a bit of a surprise. With the success of Lunala Xerneas in Moon Series, it makes sense that it would probably carry over. Groudon Lunala is interesting. You do get Tailwind and Trick Room with Lunala, but yeah. Aside from that, I think that's pretty expected, everything up there. Ultra Necrozma makes its first appearance with Groudon at a 5% usage. Originally I had these separated because I think that Ultra Necrozma from a Duskmane form and Ultra Necrozma from a Dawnwings form are slightly different. But I ended up combining them because I think it's more representative of actual usage. And then from there you see a few more Groudon combinations with Veltal and Kyogre, and then Ultra Necrozma and Xerneas. There were a lot of others at slightly smaller usage, and then quite a few more below that. Moving on to Mega Evolutions, Salamence is dominating Mega Evolution. It's almost 40% of teams use a Mega Salamence. The dual Mega option here is pretty much exclusively Rayquaza Gengar teams. In those cases, made the assumption that they were both able to Mega Evolve. That's not always true. In some cases I was able to confirm if it was Rayquaza or Gengar, but not always. So you could basically split that 15.83% between Rayquaza and Gengar to give you a better sense of exactly what Mega Evolutions you'll be going up against. Rayquaza sitting at 15%, Gengar at a little over 10. Again, 2 Pokemon that you'd expect to be very strong and be used very often in the format. Next up is Kangaskhan. Kangaskhan got nerfed relative to the last the VGC16 with losing Power Up Punch and Parental Bond, kind of losing a little bit of its luster, a little bit of its damage output, but it's still pretty high usage. Being able to use Fake Out against Ghost types with Blue Lunala is really useful. Next up, you see somewhat of a surprising entry, No Mega. No Mega is more common than any of the other Megas on this list, aside from the top 4. You just don't use a Mega. Lopunny's right there at 2.5%, and then you have Mawile, Manectric, and Lucario at 1.67%. There were a bunch of other Megas used, so these were on 4 teams, these 3. No, they were on, 4 teams. Then Mewtwo Y was on 3, and it kind of dissipated down there to individual usages that popped up here and there. Tapus. The Tapus are pretty much being dominated by Feeny and Coco. Specifically Feeny, up near 28%. Coco sitting above 25%. No Tapu is at 24.58%. That's maybe high, maybe low. I guess with the restricted slots and a Mega slot needing to be taken up, sometimes controlling terrain isn't that important relative to supporting your restricted Pokemon. So it's decently high. Tapu Lele is falling behind Feeny and Coco at 17.5%. A dual combination with 2 Tapus on the team came in at 4.5%, and no one loves Tapu Bulu at all. From here we have speed control usage. So again, this is based off of what was actually used in battle. So in battle, speed control wasn't used at all 43.75% of the time. Tailwind was used 34% of the time. Trick Room a little over 15% of the time, and then a team using both 6.67%. Now again, this is over a match that's 3 games. If they use Trick Room in one game and Tailwind in another game, that would count as dual for that team composition. So this is probably the least useful data, just because it's somewhat irregular how it's been tabulated. Moving on from usage stats to win rates, this is what I think is most interesting. We can see that the common restricted pairs, we can see their win rate here. Some things that jump out: Groudon Xerneas at 54.37% is pretty good, considering that basically every team is designed to have answers for it. It's still winning a majority of games, and so all of these win rates have removed Mirror, so this doesn't count Groudon Xerneas versus Groudon Xerneas, which was a lot of matches, and you would expect that to kind of trend the overall win rate towards 50%, but all of the Mirror matches have been removed. From there we see Kyogre Rayquaza performing very poorly at a 33.87% win rate. I know I initially started looking into that direction with Kyogre Rayquaza, and I found it very frustrating. Groudon Lunala also performing poorly. Lunala Xerneas a little bit better, kind of the antithesis of Groudon Xerneas in terms of a win rate. Not great, but it's not nearly as bad as Kyogre Rayquaza, Groudon Lunala. From there we start to see some things with positive win rates. Rayquaza Xerneas at 58.18, Groudon Ultra Necrozma coming in at exactly 50% win rate. Groudon Yveltal actually has a very high win rate at 70.37% thus far. Dual Primals at 48% and Ultra Necrozma Xerneas at 75%, also doing really well so far. Moving on to the Mega Evolutions and their win rate, once again with the mirror matches removed, so Salamence against Salamence, it's pretty inconclusive, so we went ahead and took that out. Across the board, notable performers, excuse me, Salamence 53.54, again, does well even when a lot of teams are preparing for it. Also got Lopunny at 85.71%, again, scrappy Fake Out, doing a lot of work for it. Kind of a corollary, something you'd expect to also do well would be Kangaskhan, but it's at a very low win rate at 48.54%. No Mega has an exact 50% win rate. Dual Megas seems pretty bad. Dual Megas is actually one of the worst ones thus far, especially amongst things that have high usage. Only winning 40.28% of the time. Moving on to the Tapus, we have Coco at exactly 50%. Feeny actually at a low 39.34, and so a lot of this is actually driven by the fact that we're removing any mirror matches, so Feeny versus Feeny is getting taken away right away. And if you look at Feeny, kind of just think about it against the other Tapus or a dual Tapu, it's generally not going to have an advantage, especially against the Tapu Koko team, just because of the typing there. No Tapu's coming in at 53% win rate, and Tapu Lele actually has a 63.53% win rate. Really high. Dual Tapu's coming down at 39.29%, and sadly for our boy Tapu Ulu, we will never know how much it wins, because it will never be used. Speed control win rate, again, hard to draw conclusions from here because the data going into it's pretty bad. No speed control is winning a little bit less than 50% of the time, so maybe you can look into that and say that using speed control does have a net positive. Specifically, it seems that using Tailwind is giving you an advantage versus not using Tailwind or using another speed control form. Trick Room is a little bit below 50%, and Duel actually seems to be doing the worst out of these options, down at 42.11% win rate. So another thing that's interesting to look at is some of the restricted pair matchups. I don't think there's really enough data to start drawing any conclusions here, but you can see specific archetypes and how they match up. One of the interesting ones here is looking at Kyogre Rayquaza against Groudon Xerneas. That 20% win rate is really low, and Groudon Xerneas is a matchup you have to be able to win to be successful, from what I've seen in the data that I've looked over. Aside from that, there's really not that much data for any of these points to really be that interesting. I guess you can look at Lunala Xerneas having 100% win rate over some teams, but you can see that this is based off probably 3 data points. This could be 1, this could be 1, so there's not much here yet, but some initial thoughts that you can come across. Definitely Kyogre Rayquaza against Groudon Xerneas is bad. Groudon Xerneas doing really well against Groudon Lunala is another thing to think about. That's a pretty high win rate, so you know that's going to be a tough matchup. Basically, Groudon Xerneas has good matchups across the board. Even Groudon Yveltal is neutral. Groudon Kyogre, it's probably only 1 or 2 matchups there, so not too much there. And any NAs means that matchup hasn't occurred yet. So, one other thing that came up watching these games is that this team here, the Groudon Xerneas, Salamence, Tapu Fini, Amoonguss, and Incineroar, is the most common team ever. If you want to start theory spawning against a team to see if your team can beat something, this is the team you should probably start with. This team was used very, very, very frequently, including, I think, a couple mirrors. Some other lessons learned from watching 120 best of 3 sets. It looked like setting speed control, especially first, so being the first one to kind of blink in that regard, was pretty often a detriment. A lot of teams are set up really well to stall or abuse the speed control that you set. So if you set Trick Room, they've often got an Amoonguss or their own, or a Bronzong or something that can abuse it, and at the end of your turn, all you've really done is wasted a turn setting a speed control that they can take advantage of. Special Groudon performed really well, which I was surprised at. I knew it would be good, but it does pretty well in the mirror, being able to use Earth Power against other Groudons, and with Groudon being very, very common, it's really nice to have that matchup, and also to not get walled by Wide Guard. Another thing that's been coming up a lot in these tournament matchups, which I thought was really surprising, is the usage of double and even triple protects. So a lot of these players are very good, and all of them are very competent. And to get in a position where you have to rely on a double or triple protect is really suboptimal. But it's happening a lot, and I think that has to do a lot with the very offensive nature of the meta right now. There's a lot of pressure on you at all times because of the just insane damage output from all of these Pokemon. So you often put yourself in a position where you do need a double protect to either reposition yourself or to win an in-game. And I think it's very interesting that that situation has come up many times in games. Another thing here, there's a few replays that I can either link in the description or in comments or something like that. There are teams that innovate and do very well. These teams are using mons that are crazy, that you wouldn't think about. Shedinja is still a huge threat. For instance, I think there's a Mega Alakazam replay with basically a full support Mega Alakazam, and it basically swept the game, both games in the match that it was in. It's really amazing to see some of the innovation that comes up, but you still have to be able to beat Groudon Xerneas. If you can't do that, it really doesn't matter. So, those are some interesting things that I've seen so far. Let me know what you think. If you're interested in getting any more of the data, hit me up directly and I can post it, or I can share it with you. Alright, thanks. Bye.